I think it's incredibly disheartening. And I also think it is a huge strategic misstep because at the end of the day, you're going to permanently turn off Democratic voters if you consistently just treat them as just votes and commodities and not as real people whose issues you should be working on.
Welcome to The Real News. I'm Jaisal Noor in Wisconsin, where we're reporting on the fight against voter suppression. But as we speak, Democrats in D.C. are gutting their own economic agenda, slashing trillions of dollars of promises they made to voters to win the last election cycle. So some are asking the question, do the Democrats want to get wiped out in the 2022 midterms? That's because they are on the verge of squandering a historic opportunity, razor-thin majorities in the House and Senate, and the popularity of a first-term president, because two senators, Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, and the special interests corporate lobbyists that have backed them have argued that even a pared-down $3.5 trillion compromise proposal is too large for the country to afford. Manchin has said he prefers $1.5 trillion, which means $2 trillion in spending needs to be cut. As we're recording this interview, there's more development. Something like $1.75 trillion might be acceptable to them, but even those numbers don't come close to the need that Americans face today, especially in places like where we are now, Milwaukee, where we're talking to Angela Lang, executive director of BLOC, Black Leaders Organizing for Communities, a group that launched 4 years ago to help mobilize and engage black voters after a sharp drop-off in participation in the 2016 election, which was a major factor in Trump's win. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Yeah, thank you.
So your organization, BLOC, organizes, advocates for, and builds power in some of the most disinvested, incarcerated, and segregated communities in Milwaukee and across Wisconsin. You backed Biden and the Democrats in this last election. You're in regular communication with the White House. Democrats have yet to deliver on their promises, some which would address some of the deep needs of communities that turned out, during a pandemic and voted for him here. What are your thoughts right now?
I think I'm incredibly disappointed, and I think I speak for a lot of people, to say the least. I think that's an understatement. People vote for Democrats because they're persuaded to, because we're told that if we do, our lives are going to get better. And that's why people show up and vote, because people want their lives to be better. They believe the promises, the campaign promises that people run on. And so it's incredibly disheartening that people in campaigns always come to our community in the 11th hour, tell us the sky's falling and how much we need to show up and vote and how much is going to change our lives and our circumstances and our communities and our neighborhoods if we just show up. And then we do show up, and then none of those changes happen. And in fact, Democrats are running away from some of those changes. It's incredibly transactional. It's like people really just use us to get elected, but actually don't care about our issues and our communities in the way that they said that they did when they tried to earn our votes. And so I think it's incredibly disheartening. And I also think it is a huge strategic misstep because at the end of the day, you're going to permanently turn off Democratic voters if you consistently just treat them as just votes and commodities and not as real people whose issues you should be working on.
So some of the things on the chopping block in this pared down $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill is $500 million for paid federal family and medical leave. The U.S. is the only wealthy country that doesn't offer it, which means the majority of Americans, a disproportionate number who are people of color, aren't able to take time off to take care of themselves or their loved ones. And, that is something that we've heard is a major issue in Milwaukee. What kind of impact would that have on a city like Milwaukee?
It would be huge. We tried to pass paid family leave here in the city and have paid sick days specifically. And that was shot down roughly 10 years ago. And it seems like a backwards part of society that people aren't even able to take this paid leave and take time when they actually need it. I think it would be incredibly strong for our economy. There are times that people have to go into work while they're feeling sick. That's a completely different conversation these days of what that means. And there are so many times that people have to make these sacrifices. They may not have reliable childcare. And so who knows what's going to happen when they have to work 2 or 3 jobs. And then we try to say, oh, yeah, don't forget to vote when they're working. They don't have the ability to take off. They have to continue to work multiple jobs because childcare costs are through the roof as well. And so it really comes down to a quality of life thing as well. People are not able to have their basic needs met and are not even able to have, paid family leave. And then we're even having conversations about if people are able to take things like paternity leave, right? These aren't radical things, but they're framed as radical notions. But these are basic human rights and basic human dignity issues that I think need to be addressed and I think are incredibly long overdue. Even things like equal pay. Why are we still having a conversation about equal pay? This is something that should have been solved long before I was even born. We've been having these conversations for decades, and then we're having generations of folks continue to fall into these pitfalls. And then what we also see is that these issues intersect with other issues. So if you don't have, paid family leave, then you have to find childcare, but you can't afford childcare. And then you have to work multiple jobs, and then to work multiple jobs, you need childcare. So it's a vicious cycle that people have a really hard time getting out of. And a lot of times these issues intersect and it ends up being a snowball effect.
Some of the other things on the chopping block are money for community college, higher education, and addressing climate change through the creation of millions of green jobs, of jobs in clean energy. What kind of impact would that have on a city like Milwaukee, which faces deindustrialization? We were driving through a neighborhood where one of the ambassadors from Block was telling us that these communities used to be thriving when there was factories, when there was employment here, but when those jobs left, everything started to crumble. And so the Democrats have an opportunity to bring back jobs in cities and build for a sustainable future, which we know we're running out of time. So what kind of impact would that have? And what does this say about the power of corporate lobbyists, which seem to have a stranglehold over the Democratic Party?
Yeah, in Milwaukee, unfortunately, we have lead in our drinking water. So we don't even have basic clean water in a lot of places. And we can paint a picture of where those lead pipes and those lead laterals are. They're typically in Black and brown communities. So again, it's kind of the basic human rights. There used to be a lot of good union jobs here in Milwaukee. And when those jobs left, we saw people's quality of life decline. We've seen people struggle. There used to be a lot of Black neighborhoods that were homeowners, and people are renting to get by. And no shade to renters, I'm a renter myself, but people don't even have those opportunities if they even want them. And so by being able to see how not having a union or even having these like good union family sustaining jobs really can have an adverse effect on so many other things in our society. If you don't have a job but you have a family to feed, you're going to do whatever you have to do. And so when we talk about crime and safety, it's these things that we're talking about. If we want to be serious about curbing crime, we need to make sure we have jobs. People have livable wages. They don't have to work multiple jobs or do whatever they have to do to survive these days. And so I think it's incredibly disheartening that this is a very, I think, basic type of thing to work on. And a lot of times people are like, I'm going to bring jobs, and here's a real tangible opportunity to do so, and it's being stalled. Climate change as well. This younger generation, the Gen Zers, they don't even think that they have a future. And that breaks my heart to know that there is this environmental injustice that's happening, that people in Black and brown communities have more asthma because given geographically where they're located and given the exhaust and whatnot, people build, power plants or, certain type of industries that lead to air pollution, but they put those places in communities of color, which decrease our physical health. And not just pollute the air, but it's all of these different things, again, that I think are really intersecting together. And then if we have an opportunity to actually work on climate change and bring jobs to people, that seems like a no-brainer for folks. And so it's very frustrating to know that this is being stalled.
In the next part of our interview, we'll talk more about what Block does and how you do it and what you're all about. But for people that missed the first part of this interview, and we'll watch it next because it's going to be great, talk about how many doors does block knock on. How many phone calls did you make in the last election? So, and just to give people a sense of like sort of where you're coming from when you're saying this.
Yeah, so we knock all the time, and COVID put a damper on our field program. We shut down our office in March of 2020, just a few weeks before the April election, and we had to get tools like Hustle, which is a texting program. It's a fairly common tool, but it's one that we didn't have because we're so rooted in knocking on doors. So we knock on doors virtually 24/7. We were able last year to at least do some literature drops. So we weren't comfortable having face-to-face conversations. We were able to leave literature on people's doors. So at least people were getting that information. Last year, I think we had over 220,000 phone calls were made with our ambassadors. And they sent over 550,000 text messages over the course of just a few months last year. And what I always want to note when I say those numbers is that these numbers were hit by our ambassadors who are not immune to the same things that we're fighting for. And so a part about being a part of the community that you're organizing is that the same challenges that the broader community is dealing with, so is our team. And they still showed up and did this work all the time. Increased domestic violence issues after the stay-at-home orders, or increased mental health challenges due to isolation. All of those things that gone unnoticed but are very real in people's lives due to the pandemic, or what our ambassadors were dealing with day in and day out as they were texting, as they were phone banking, and making sure that everyone knew how to make their voices heard. So I was really trying to let people know and to ground people in that is that we have that direct personal experience every time we have a conversation with someone.
And the stakes for especially Wisconsin in 2022, voters will pick a senator. We know Ron Johnson, your current senator, who may or may not run for re-election, he is one of the strongest backers of COVID denial, of pushing conspiracy theories, of saying that the election was stolen from Trump. So his position is very clear. Yeah. And at the same time, you're going to be electing your governor, and with the control that Republicans have over both houses of your Assembly and Senate, which is basically unbreakable because of gerrymandering, what would it mean if there is a lack of enthusiasm in 2022 and Republicans take all three centers of power in Wisconsin and also have a Republican governor? Would there be any way to stop what would likely be an onslaught on voting rights, on workers' rights?
I think it would be devastating, quite frankly. I think, the governor has done the best that he's able to do under the circumstances in a heavily gerrymandered Republican-led legislature. And so a lot of times our governor has to just play goalie. And every time something terrible passes the legislature, we can count on him to veto those things and then sign, hopefully, all the good things that come out of there, which there aren't a lot these days, unfortunately. There's a couple of good things. And so I think it would be incredibly devastating for our state. And I think it would also be devastating for our country if we're actually thinking about long term and the impact of what 2024 could look like. Are we going to continue these audits? Are we going to continue having these types of big lie conversations? And then if you have a trifecta of Republican control in Wisconsin, which is probably bound to be another swing state in 2024, we don't have that goalie stopping these conversations. We don't have that pushback. We don't have that veto pen anymore. And I think it would be incredibly devastating. And adding to that, if Ron Johnson, if he were to run, continues to get reelected, or there's, is a Republican in that seat, we also see how that directly would impact the Democrats' already limited ability to pass legislation in Congress that we know is also being directly felt here in Wisconsin as well. So I think there's a lot at stake for the midterms in so many ways. And I think our job is less of trying to make these candidates sound great and charismatic, but really to articulate all of that and what that sense of urgency is and why we need to show up and what's at stake.
And to be clear, based on this big lie that the election was stolen from Trump in states like Wisconsin, Republicans have proposed and introduced and passed even more restrictive voting measures in Wisconsin, but that's been vetoed by the governor. If Rebecca Clayfish, who's one of the leading candidates to challenge Governor Evers, if she wins, she's already promised to to put those restrictions into law. You know, Wisconsin already has some of the strictest voting ID laws. Yeah. They closed almost all the precincts in Milwaukee in last year's primary. What would voting look like under a Republican governor in 2024?
I don't even want to imagine what that looks like. It sounds like it's incredibly scary. You know, I think for us, we need to just paint that picture that this is a very obvious tactic of trying to make sure that our community stays home. You know, we've talked about the racial implications around voter suppression. It's a class issue. There's elderly folks that have issues when it comes to voting and whatnot. And so we also see that, you know, voter suppression is not just something that impacts, you know, Democratic leaning people. That's all across the board. They also could be using this to weaken their own base as well. And so I think it's an agitational point for those that are in the organizing field. You know, you think of what is the agitation that gets people riled up. And it's like, that is not OK. That is very screwed up. And I need to show up and vote. And so I think for us, we want to make sure that we're getting the word out. We want everyone to know exactly what she's saying. Right. If we need to have literature that's just publishing her words and that's like a true fact in a statement, that is enough, I think, hopefully to turn people out. I don't think it's going to be a lot of persuasion, so to speak, about, you know, because I think Rebecca Clayfish is very extreme, that I don't think it's going to be a persuasion conversation. It's going to be about turnout, and it's going to come down to what side can turn out people more. But it would be incredibly devastating if there was a Republican trifecta and we know all the increased voter suppression tactics that would happen here. And I would be very concerned about the long-term voting implications of that for our state and ideally for our country, because we know that Wisconsin can be a petri dish for things that happen across the country. And so I would be really concerned that Wisconsin would be a example for some other states to kind of spread some of that voter suppression, really extreme, dangerous rhetoric and ideas and policies.
So we can't end this conversation on a depressing note like that.
Yes.
So what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is my team, quite frankly, to know that our team does this work day in and day out, and they do it through a place of love and joy. The team at Block, we're like a family. We have our own family agreements. We have rules of how we all operate, and being able to see their own growth and development just in just a few years. There are some folks that have been with us since day one. Our deputy director has been with us since day one. She started as an organizer, and now she's my right hand, who I can't function without. And so I think for me, being able to see people's leadership development is what I think gives me hope in these really tough times. And there are a lot of times I'm cynical and jaded, but to know the extreme circumstances that people go through just to show up and to do this work because of how passionate and dedicated they are, and to see their growth, and to know that I had just a small little hand in playing a role in their growth and development, that is the best thing for me. It's not for me to say this is what people should be doing and feeling and this is the agenda. I want people to be equipped with the tools and the resources to be able to take whatever they want to work on and whatever issues they care about the most, they can take those on themselves. So I'm encouraged to see more and more people getting involved and getting engaged that maybe never would have before.
So we've been talking to Angela Lang, Executive Director of Block, Black Leaders Organizing for Communities, a group that launched 4 years ago to help mobilize and energize and engage Black voters in Milwaukee, which was, as we've mentioned, one of the most disinvested, segregated, and incarcerated cities in the country, and as a real microcosm for the inequities and inequalities that are present and prevalent throughout the United States. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for being here and taking time to visit Milwaukee.
And thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.